Matthew 6:33 is etched in the memory of almost everyone who has ever set foot in a church. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. It's one of those verses that appear in carved wooden frames hanging in the living room, in Instagram posts with gold backgrounds, embroidered on cushions, printed on coffee mugs. And perhaps that's exactly the problem. When a phrase becomes decoration, it ceases to be true, not because it's no longer true, but because we stop truly hearing it. We recognize the words, but we no longer listen to them. It's like a bell that rings every morning. On the first day, you wake up. On the 10th, you hear nothing more. I want to invite you to hear this phrase again. Not as you heard it the last time someone quoted it in a sermon, not as it appears in italics over a picture of a sunset. I want you to hear it as it sounded the first time, that afternoon, when Jesus was sitting on a hill with a group of people who had absolutely nothing guaranteed. People who woke up not knowing if they would eat, who worked the land with their hands and depended on the rain and the mercy of the powerful to survive. For these people, this phrase was not decoration. It was the most radical, most disconcerting, most unbelievable thing anyone had ever said to them in their entire lives. And the question that remains, the question that I think is worth asking slowly, is this: what was Jesus really saying? What is this kingdom that He commanded to seek first? What is this righteousness that appears soon after, almost in passing, as if it were just a detail? And what does it mean, concretely, in the life of a real human being, to seek first something? Because I have the impression that most of the answers we heard to these questions were too small for the magnitude of what Jesus was proposing. Let me consider this for a moment. Jesus wasn't speaking to a theological audience. He wasn't in a seminary discussing abstract concepts. He was on a hillside, outdoors, surrounded by ordinary people, and what He said was so concrete that the previous sentence speaks of birds, and the next sentence speaks of lilies. He used images from the real world, the world those people knew, to say something that goes far beyond what the surface of the word suggests. And when you understand the context, when you understand what the word kingdom means in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in the mind of a first-century Jew, everything changes. Not a little. Everything. The word behind kingdom in Jesus' thought is Malkut. In Hebrew, Malkut is not a place. It is not a territory with borders on a map. Malkut is a state of affairs. It is the kingdom as a living reality, as a present condition, as the order of the world where God's will truly happens. When Jesus said the kingdom of God, He was not talking about a place you go to after you die. He was talking about a reality that can be lived now, here, at this moment, in this body, on this earth. A reality where things are as they should be, where the weak are not crushed by the strong, where bread reaches everyone, where lies do not win, where human dignity is not negotiable. And He was saying, seek this first. Don't seek this after you've solved your financial problems. Don't seek this when life is calmer. Don't seek this as some kind of spiritual bonus on top of an already organized life. Seek this first. Let this be the axis around which everything else revolves. Here, I want you to notice something important. The immediate context of Matthew 6:33 is one of the longest and most dense teachings of Jesus that we have recorded. The entire chapter 6 of the Gospel of Matthew is part of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And in it, Jesus builds an argument that many people have read in pieces, without realizing that it is a single, continuous argument that only makes complete sense when you see the whole thing. He begins by talking about how to do charitable works without ostentation, how to pray without theatricality, how to fast without performance. And then he makes a turn that seems abrupt, but is actually the logical conclusion of everything he said before. He begins to talk about money, about treasures, about where you keep what you consider valuable. And he says a phrase that few people really stop to consider. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. This is in Matthew 6:24. And from there, Jesus enters into something that seems like a spiral of liberation. He begins to speak of God's care for animals and plants. The birds of the air, he says, do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet the Father feeds them. The lilies of the field do not labor or spin, and yet not even Solomon in all his glory was dressed like one of these. And then he looks at the people around him and says something that should have sounded like a gentle provocation. If God cares for the birds and the flowers like this, how much more will he care for you? And then he gets to verse 33. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. But notice what comes before in verse 32. He says, the pagans run after all these things. The pagans, the Gentiles, the nations that do not know the God of Israel. They are the ones who spend their entire lives organizing their existence around material survival, around accumulation, around the security that money supposedly guarantees. And Jesus is saying, this is not for you. You have been called to a different order of existence. Here, the tension begins to become visible, because it's easy to read this and conclude that Jesus was asking people to be irresponsible, not to think about the future, not to work, not to plan. But that would be a hasty reading, and ultimately dishonest with the text. Jesus wasn't preaching irresponsibility. He was preaching reorientation. He was saying, the problem isn't that you worry about bread. The problem is when bread becomes the center of everything, when your identity, your security, your value as a human being become tied to the amount of things you manage to accumulate or secure. And that distinction is enormous, because most of us live in that exact tension. We want to follow God. We want to live with integrity. We want faith to be real. But we also have bills to pay. We have children to raise. We have an uncertain future. And sometimes the question isn't whether you'll seek the kingdom, but whether you can even breathe enough to think about the kingdom when anxiety is suffocating everything. And I think Jesus knew that, because he didn't say those words to people who had their lives guaranteed. He said them to people who had far less security than most of us have today. Imagine for a moment the concrete situation of those people. Galilee in the 1st century was a region under Roman occupation. Taxes were heavy. The land that most cultivated did not belong to them, but to large landowners, often linked to the priestly elite of Jerusalem. The life of a Jewish peasant in Jesus' time was marked by a precariousness that is difficult for us today to truly imagine. There was no health system, no social security, no unemployment insurance. If the harvest failed, you went hungry. If you got sick and couldn't work, your family went hungry. The margin for error was zero. For these people, hearing Jesus say, "Do not worry about what you will eat or drink or wear," must have sounded like an almost cruel provocation, or like something that would only make sense if the accompanying promise was absolutely real. And the promise was this: if you seek first the kingdom, the things you need will be added to you. This word, added, is interesting. In Greek, the text uses prostathesetai, which carries the idea of something being added to something that already exists, as if the kingdom were the foundation and everything else were built upon it. Not as a magical reward, not as a transaction where you give devotion and receive material prosperity in return, but as an organic, natural consequence of living in a different order of things. And here's where I need to pause for a moment, because there's a very popular reading of Matthew 6:33 that I think completely distorts what Jesus was saying. It's the reading that has transformed this verse into a kind of prosperity formula. The idea that if you put God first, understood here as giving, attending church services, participating in church life, then God will bless you financially, give you health, give you success, give you everything you need and more. That seeking the kingdom is a spiritual strategy for having a good life in the sense that the world defines as a good life. But that's exactly what Jesus was deconstructing. He was saying that it's the pagans who chase after these things. Jesus' promise wasn't that seeking the kingdom would give you the same things the pagans sought, only with a divine blessing on top. The promise was that seeking the kingdom would free you from the desperate need for these things, that you would find a way to exist in the world where anxiety about the future doesn't paralyze you, where scarcity doesn't define who you are, where you can give because you're not clinging, you can forgive because you're not controlling, you can trust because you're not trying to secure everything alone. This is completely different, and it's much more demanding because the prosperity gospel, at its core, is comforting. It says you can want what everyone else wants, and that God will give it to you if you do the right things. But the interpretation that emerges from the actual context of the Sermon on the Mount is different. It says that wanting different things is the key. That transformation begins precisely with what you desire, what you consider valuable, what you are willing to lose in order to preserve what truly matters. And the word that appears alongside kingdom in this verse is crucial. Justice. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. In Greek, dikaiosune. In Hebrew, the equivalent would be tzedakah. And tzedakah in biblical thought is not just justice in the sense of laws and courts. It is a word that carries the idea of relational righteousness, of a correct order in relationships between people, of a world where each person receives what they need to live with dignity. Here, I want you to observe something that is rarely taught. In the Hebrew tradition, tzedakah is often translated as charity, but this translation shrinks the original concept too much. When a Jew practices tzedakah, he is not doing a favor. He is fulfilling an obligation. The idea is that what you have in excess does not truly belong to you, and giving back a portion of it to those in need is not extraordinary generosity. It is simply what is right. It is the correct order of things. It is the world functioning as it should. When Jesus says, seek justice, he is using that word with all the weight behind it. He is not talking about a feeling of doing good. He is talking about a practice, a way of relating to the world and to other people that reflects the order of the kingdom, an order where the excess of some is not justified by the scarcity of others, where sharing is what is normal, not what is exceptional, where caring for the weak is not an optional virtue, but an expression of the identity of those who live under God's sovereignty. And this connects directly to what Jesus says earlier in the same chapter about storing up treasures. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And here, again, a very common reading takes this phrase and projects it into the future, into the afterlife, into a heavenly reward that awaits you somewhere beyond. But what Jesus called heaven wasn't necessarily a geographical address in the afterlife. It was a way of being. It was the kingdom that already exists as a real possibility, that can be lived now, that begins to take shape whenever someone acts in accordance with God's will. Storing treasures in heaven can simply mean building things that last. Real human relationships, acts of generosity that change lives, a community where people support each other, things that moths cannot devour, that time cannot erase, that death cannot take away, because they are inscribed in a reality that is beyond any power of destruction. Let me consider this. There's a moment in the Gospel of Luke where someone goes to Jesus and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus responds with something that seems almost rude in its directness. "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator between you?" And then he turns to the crowd and says, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he tells the parable of the rich man who had a great harvest, who built larger barns to store everything, who said to his soul, "Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." And God says to him that very night, "You fool, this very night your soul will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" This parable is found in Luke 12, and it precedes, by a few chapters, a parallel version of what Jesus says in Matthew 6. And the guiding thread is the same. Life is not in things. Security is not in barns. Existence is not reduced to what you have managed to accumulate. But I want us to look at this without easy romanticism, because it's tempting to hear these words and conclude that poverty is virtuous, that having little is a sign of deep spirituality, that those who accumulate are wrong by definition. And that's not what Jesus was saying either. The rich man's problem wasn't that he had barns. It was that the barns had him. It was that his identity, his security, his relationship with the future were all anchored in what he had managed to save. And when you anchor your existence in things, you become a hostage to them. You can no longer give freely. You can no longer take risks. You can no longer trust. Because trusting would mean giving up control, and giving up control threatens the only foundation you know. Seeking the kingdom first is exactly the opposite of that. It's finding a foundation that cannot be shaken by changing circumstances. It's building your life on something that doesn't depend on you being able to guarantee everything. And that's not naivete. It's not irresponsibility. It's a very specific form of courage, the courage to live as if God's promise were real. And here, I want us to enter a territory that is rarely explored when this verse is taught. Because Matthew 6:33 is not just individual instruction. It's not just advice for the personal life of each believer. It is embedded in a teaching that has collective, communal, profoundly social dimensions. The Lord's Prayer, which appears in the same chapter, from verse 9 onwards, asks, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." This is not a privatized prayer. It is a declaration of intent about the world. It is a prayer that asks that God's order be established in the concrete, visible, tangible reality of human life. And when you understand the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, you realize that Jesus was describing an alternative community, a group of people who live according to a different logic, who do not accumulate like pagans accumulate, who do not resolve conflicts like the world does, who do not treat enemies like the world does, who do not seek revenge, who do not organize their existence around fear, a community where the meek inherit the earth, where the merciful receive mercy, where those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are satisfied. Here I want you to notice something important. The Beatitudes, which open the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, are not a list of abstract virtues that people should cultivate individually. They are a description of who the citizens of the kingdom are. They are a collective portrait. And when you arrive at Matthew 6:33 with this portrait in mind, the phrase changes dimension. Seeking the kingdom is not a solitary spiritual exercise. It is entering into a form of shared existence with others who are also choosing to live according to this different order. And that is perhaps what tradition has most radically reduced. It took a teaching that had communal, political, economic, and relational dimensions, and shrunk it until it fit into a wooden frame. It transformed it into spiritual self-help advice. Put God first, and everything will work out for you. But Jesus wasn't talking about everything working out for you. He was talking about a world that functions differently. And he was saying that this different way of functioning begins when a group of people decides to live according to it, even before the whole world has adopted it. This has frightening implications, because it means that seeking the kingdom is not compatible with indifference to the suffering of others. It is not compatible with enriching oneself in ways that impoverish others. It is not compatible with a faith that remains only within the four walls of a religious gathering and doesn't overflow into how you act at work, in the market, in politics, in the neighborhood. The kingdom that Jesus commanded us to seek first is not a kingdom that exists only on Sunday mornings. And perhaps that's why this phrase is so unsettling when you take it seriously. Because when you stop treating it as mere decoration and start treating it as a real instruction, it shakes everything up. It shakes up your time priorities. It shakes up what you do with your money. It shakes up how you treat the people who depend on you. It shakes up which news stories disturb you and which ones leave you indifferent. It shakes up what you call success. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to truly live with the kingdom as your top priority. Not the kingdom as a theological concept, but the kingdom as a practical reality. God's will happening on earth as it is in heaven. What changes on your Monday? What changes in the way you do business, in the way you resolve disagreements, in the way you use what's left over at the end of the month, in the way you treat those who have no voice? I'm not asking rhetorical questions. I'm asking questions that I myself needed to ask, because it's very easy to have this verse memorized and at the same time live in a way that has no relation to what it's proposing. Familiarity with sacred words can become a sophisticated way of avoiding what they are saying. And here, I want you to observe something that appears strongly when you look at the prophets of the Old Testament. The problem that the prophets repeatedly pointed out in ancient Israel was not that the people had abandoned religious practices. Often, it was quite the opposite. The people offered sacrifices, observed the festivals, followed the rituals. But the prophet Amos cried out, I despise your religious festivals, and I take no pleasure in your solemn assemblies. Why? Because while they celebrated, they trampled on the poor and took their grain. They built houses of hewn stone, but would not live in them. They planted delicious vineyards, but would not drink their wine. Religiousness was intact. Justice was absent. Isaiah says the same thing in other words. The fast that pleases God, he says, is not bowing one's head like a reed and lying in sackcloth and ashes. The fast that God has chosen is to loosen the bonds of injustice, untie the ties of the yoke, set the oppressed free, share bread with the hungry, shelter the poor wanderer, clothe the naked. What Jesus does in Matthew 6:33 is, in a way, a synthesis of all this prophetic tradition. He is saying, what are you placing at the center of your life? Is it accumulation, security, material guarantees? Or is it God's order, which is an order of justice, of right relationships, of shared dignity? And he is saying that choosing the second option is not harmful to your life. It is what makes your life truly life. There is a real tension here that I don't want to resolve easily, because it deserves to be addressed. Because Jesus' promise wasn't fulfilled in the same way for everyone who chose to seek the kingdom first. There were people who chose that life and were persecuted. They were imprisoned. They were killed. The history of Christian martyrdom is long and real, and it's very easy to read the promise of all things will be added unto you and wonder, added how? For those who died? For those who lost everything for not giving up what they believed in? And I think the honest answer requires us to broaden the way we read this promise. Because Jesus wasn't promising the absence of suffering. Nowhere in the Sermon on the Mount does he promise that. He promises that the Father knows what you need, that your life is in the hands of someone who is trustworthy, that there is a deeper reality than the variation of external circumstances, that the kingdom you seek is more real, more permanent, more substantial than anything the world can give or take away. This is different from a promise of prosperity. It's a promise of foundation. It's the difference between saying, I'll give you a good time, and saying, I'll give you an anchor that can withstand any storm. And perhaps that's exactly where the verse regains all its power when you stop reading it as a formula and start reading it as an invitation. Not an invitation to a life without problems, an invitation to a life organized around something that problems cannot destroy. A life where what you seek first is also what remains when everything else falters. The Greek text we have from Matthew 6:33 uses the verb zeteiate, which is a present imperative, a continuous action, not a one-off event. It's not seek the kingdom once and that's it. It's keep seeking, keep this gesture alive, make it a permanent practice. The kingdom is not something you find and keep in your pocket. It's something that requires constant guidance, like a boat that always needs to adjust its sail to stay on course. The search doesn't end. It's a way of life. And perhaps that's why Jesus doesn't offer a technique. He doesn't say, do this for so many hours a day, and that for so many days a week. He describes a profound orientation of desire, a reorientation of what you want, what you consider important, what moves you. And this, by definition, doesn't have a fixed endpoint in this life. It's a process. It's a journey. It's a path taken one day at a time, one choice at a time, one priority at a time. And here I want to bring up something that rarely appears when this verse is taught: the role of the community in this journey. Because in the Jewish tradition in which Jesus was formed, faith was not an individual endeavor. It was lived within a community, sustained by it, demanded by it. You didn't seek justice alone. You sought it together with others who shared the same commitment, who called you to account, who supported you when you faltered. The Sermon on the Mount, as I said before, describes an alternative community. And the pursuit of the kingdom is not something you do in isolation, in the privacy of your room, while the world around you continues to function as always. It has public expression. It has visible consequences. It transforms relationships. It creates friction with the structures of the world that function in another way. And this friction is expected. Jesus never promised that living according to the kingdom would be comfortable or socially acceptable. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. These phrases are in the same speech. And salt, in the ancient world, was not a flavorful condiment. It was an agent of preservation. It was what prevented decomposition. The idea is that a community that lives according to the kingdom functions as an agent of preservation within the world, not as an escape from the world, but as a transformative presence within it. And this brings us back to Matthew 6:33 with a depth we may never have realized. Seeking the kingdom first is not about abandoning the world. It's about entering it in a different way, with a different compass, with values that don't waver when the market wavers, with an identity that doesn't depend on external approval to remain firm, with open hands instead of closed ones, because you've discovered that what you have isn't your source of security, and therefore can be given. Is this possible? Yes. Is it easy? Never. Is this what Jesus proposed? Absolutely. And I want to end with an image that has stayed with me for a long time when I think about this verse. It's the image of a seed, not of a large, already formed tree, not of a ripened fruit, but of a seed being buried. The seed doesn't see the sun while it's underground. It's in the dark. It's undergoing a transformation that seems like death. And that seed has no way of knowing, at the moment it's buried, what will grow from it. Seeking the kingdom first has this quality. Often, it seems wasteful in the eyes of the world. It seems naive. It seems like you are giving up something real for something unseen. But the promise of Jesus, and the promise of all the prophetic tradition behind him, is that there is a life buried in that choice that the visible world cannot yet measure. That when the seed that is the kingdom finds fertile ground, what is born is greater than anything that fear could have built. I encourage you, not as a manager of your faith, but as someone on the same journey, to pick up the Bible and read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 all at once, aloud, without stopping. Not as a religious exercise, as someone hearing for the first time something said by someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. And when you get to verse 33, let it weigh on you. Let it ask the questions you may have avoided. What are you seeking first? What is at the heart of how you organize your time, your decisions, your money, your relationships? There is no single right answer you need to announce to someone. But there is an inner honesty that this verse demands. And from that honesty, when it is genuine, many of the most beautiful and lasting things that have ever happened in human history have been born. Not because people were perfect, but because they chose a center that kept them grounded even when everything around them wavered. The kingdom exists, not as a distant utopia, as a living seed that can begin to grow exactly where you are, exactly from what you decide to put in first, right now,